Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Welcome to Kiana's Shelf. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we are continuing our discussion about reparations. As you know, the United Nations voted that the transatlantic slave trade, as well as the trafficking of enslaved Africans to the Americas, was the gravest crime against humanity. That is right. And so in this video, I really want to have a brief discussion about the next election. So I will forever say thank you to the Ghana Foreign Minister, Oblekwa, for actually putting forward, I hope I'm pronouncing that name right, Samuel, for putting that forward and actually speaking out on this very human rights violation, of course, this state crime. And I think that as descendants of slaves, we do, I guess, owe a thank you to not only the country of Ghana, but also the continent of Africa, because the entire continent, as well as in Asia and then in the Middle East, these were all nations that voted in favor of the resolution. Now, to reiterate, in my previous video, a resolution does not bind the states and does not mean that they must perform any kind of action. But I think we could all acknowledge that the recognition of the transatlantic slave trade as the gravest crime against humanity was fortissimous, right? And ladies and gentlemen, I think another point to hit on here is that the idea that descendants of slaves are owed reparations by the United States is, I think, intersubjective across Black Americans, the diaspora communities, and the African communities, of course, in the continent of Africa. And we know that the United States voted against that resolution. It is really regrettable, but I think that the United States is really parsimonious when it comes to these types of atoning for its involvement and its perpetration of the transatlantic slave trade. But what I really want to get into this evening is that, and very briefly, is the next election and whether or not Black Americans within the United States realize that this is a watershed moment, right? This is a watershed moment in history. And so what I think the Ghana foreign minister did was he voted in, obviously he voted, he put forward that resolution, but he had the courage to stand up for descendants of slaves. And listen, there's another conversation about the 5 forms of reparations and what that really means and what the people in the African continent believe is sufficient to constitute reparations, and what the people in the Americas, specifically within the United States, believe is a sufficient form of reparations. But going back to the election, I think it's important for Black Americans in the next election, whether this is the midterms or whether the election that's coming up in 2028, to really choose a candidate that not only acknowledges that Black Americans should be given reparations, but to make a concrete a concrete promise by articulating that in a document. So, for example, if Black Americans collectively decided, hey, you know what, we'll put our vote towards this candidate in exchange that you write down in writing that this is like contractual, that you write down in writing that if we vote for you, that you will follow through on your end of the bargain as it relates to reparations. I think that is where we could see a bit of efficacy, right? Because again, this is one of the most important factors for the Black American community, specifically the descendant of slaves within the United States of America. And I think if Black Americans focused on it, I know that we're spending a lot of time in different sectors, especially online, with language and lineage and bills and voting. But I think if we spent a proper amount of time creating a really strong worded contract with the next candidates that could become the president of the United States of America, and to leverage our votes. I mean, I'm not in the United States, but this would be a great idea to leverage our vote. I think we would see the change that we're seeking. Again, reparations comes in many different forms. Compensation, guarantees of non-repetition. And I think seeing that in a contract, taking the 5 forms of reparations and putting that into a contract and using that to leverage our vote. Again, I'm not within the United States, but that would be something that I would be open to, that kind of change within the United States and that kind of leverage, right? And so I think if we think deeply on that and really consider coming together as a community in a united front and having a unified voice on this particular issue, I think that there is a probability that we could see that come to fruition. Now, I want to say that the issue of reparations is I think many people right now are trying to be assiduous, right, with this particular topic. And that may have followed through during the meeting, right? During the meeting, the United Nations meeting. But again, now might be the time to really structure some really strong arguments and make this like a contractual issue for the next election. We all are like au courant, right, when it comes to reparations. I think that many people know a lot about it, but then I'm seeing some arguments online that shows a bit of ignorance, and not in a negative way, right? But there needs to be an understanding that there are 5 different forms of reparations, and that I do understand that Black Americans, I'm a Black American, I'm a descendant of slaves from the United States of America, and I do understand the importance about identifying ourselves with, identifying our lineage, because of course, that is the first element, as like, for example, being a indigenous or tribal people within a land. But I think right now it's really time to move on from that and to start working on the wording and the contractual issues with regard to this particular situation. Again, I think that this is an important discussion that we should continue to have. I really apologize that I can't have long discussions right about this, because the SD card that I do have, it does not have a lot of time on it. And so I'm being really concise about this, but we will be talking about this in the upcoming days. We'll talk to you next time, ladies and gentlemen. Bye-bye.